Just a quick note, we do have interpretation available. Tenemos interpretación disponible.
It's an unseasonably mild February day, and about 100 people are gathered in a neighborhood park in North Denver. Alfonso Espina has the mic.
I'm an organizer for the GES Coalition.
GES, that's the neighborhoods of Globeville and Elyria Swansea.
There's many organizations, many residents that showed up today, and we are announcing the formation of a new coalition to fight against this data center in the background.
Behind the park where this is happening is a construction site. That's where a massive gray, boxy structure, half finished, is rising from the dirt, and it'll eventually hold thousands of computer servers. The nearly 2,000 square foot building is being built by CoreSite, a Denver-based data center developer.
Residents in this working-class, majority Latino community felt sidelined in any kind of decision-making during its development, and they're pissed.
But I think that the thing that they did not take into account was some basic research into the history of these neighborhoods. Some basic research would have showed them that they picked the wrong neighborhood to set something like this up.
Because this neighborhood is familiar with the impacts of heavy industry. In the 1800s, smelters polluted the soil and groundwater with heavy metals like lead. I-70 cut through the neighborhoods in the 1960s. And today, residents often joke you've arrived when you can smell the Purina dog food factory. Now, many residents are worried about another industry moving into their community. Data centers, the physical infrastructure behind the AI boom. And they're asking what all this means for their lives and their family.
They're not only targeting our drinking municipal water, our power, they are also targeting our only health and human lives.
We heard of use a lot of water, a lot of electricity. There was a public meeting here a little more than a year ago, and we showed up and we asked a bunch of questions.
It's going to cause a lot of harm. Queremos que se escuche nuestra voz. We want our voices to be heard. Que tengan consideración por todo el daño que está causando.
And this data center will have an impact. When it's fully up and running, it'll have the capacity to use as much electricity as Denver International Airport. The company says it won't produce any more pollution than a large office building, but that only applies if there's power on the grid. During a blackout, massive diesel generators will kick in to keep it running. That has residents concerned about the air and their overall quality of life.
The fight over this one data center in Denver is part of a much larger debate going on in the state right now. Should Colorado be trying to cash in on the building boom of the century, or throwing up guardrails around an industry hungry for already scarce resources?
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics and policy. I'm Sam Brash, the OG host of Purplish. Joining me is Taylor Dolvin with the Colorado Sun.
Hello.
And Lucas Brady Woods from KUNC.
Very happy to be here.
I was compelled to return to the host chair mostly by the show's producer, who noted that Benta is on vacation and she needed some help, but also because in my current job as a climate reporter for CPR, I've been digging into this topic of data centers a lot lately.
The AI boom has put the country and the world on a building spree as companies rush to cash in on the need for more and more computing space.
And the numbers are pretty mind-blowing. There were more than $47 billion worth of data center deals in the US and Canada just last year. Total investments in data centers could hit $3 trillion worldwide by 2030.
And here in the Mountain West, we are not being left out. We have lots of open land and energy infrastructure data centers need to tap into.
Colorado already has nearly 60 data centers, with more in the works. That's according to something called the Data Center Map. But most of them are much smaller than what you see in neighboring states. Colorado just hasn't seen the same scale of data center development so far.
States around the country are trying to figure out how to deal with this boom. Some are trying to lure data centers with tax incentives. Others are passing regulations to limit their impacts on residents and the environment.
When it comes to Colorado, this year could be a fork in the road. At the state capitol, lawmakers are choosing between competing visions for data centers in our state, seeing them either as a prize to be won or a threat to be managed.
So, data centers. I like to think of them as sort of the central nervous system of our online world. These often huge, though not always, facilities, warehouses that support cloud-based software and AI.
Taylor, you actually got to go inside a data center. What was it like? What did it look like?
The data center I visited was out in Inglewood, in a really industrial area, not near any homes, actually across the street from an Amazon warehouse. And what I saw was just rows and rows of cages of servers in them. The things that most surprised me were how hot it was inside, around 80 degrees, like uncomfortably hot. And also the noise. Some of the cloud servers are relatively quiet, but when you get close to the AI servers, they make a really loud buzzing, humming sound. They wouldn't let me record inside, and I didn't notice any loud noise from the outside. This is a relatively small data center, 18 megawatts, but there are lots of recordings out there of the noise that these things can make.
I actually just pulled one recording up on YouTube, and this seems to be maybe a bigger data center than the one you saw, but let's take a listen.
Just a nice, friendly industrial hum.
Yeah, it sounds really lovely. So with all these servers and the infrastructure to support them, these can be massive industrial buildings. And when they start popping up near people's homes and communities, people start to worry.
Soy madre, tengo hijos, tengo nietos, y me preocupo por nuestra salud y la salud de mis vecinos.
I'm a mother, I have children, I have grandchildren, and I worry about our health and the health of our neighbors.
No sabemos qué vamos a hacer y cómo va a impactar el vecindario.
We don't know what we are going to do and how is it going to impact our neighborhood.
This is Mercedes Gonzalez. She came to that news conference that we started the episode with. She's lived in Elyria, Swansea for 8 years and is a fixture in the neighborhood.
And look, I don't think anyone is excited to see a giant concrete box land in the middle of their neighborhood. I think it's pretty safe to say. But beyond just the aesthetics, what are the downsides in reality? Sam, what are the concerns you're hearing about?
You know, I think, like you said, any big construction project is going to have people who are worried about aesthetics, and that's part of the concern here. Another worry is noise. So Taylor might have mentioned it. There wasn't a lot of sound outside the data center she visited, but there was inside. And when those backup generators kick on, that could produce noise. They could produce air pollution. And adding such an energy-intensive thing to the grid means more infrastructure, and that could mean higher utility bills for these neighbors, but also for everybody who pays for Xcel Energy, in this case, their grid, which will be powering this data center.
When these data centers tap into the grid, everyone getting power from that utility is potentially affected. Power prices are already on the rise, and so people are really worried about how these data centers are going to impact their bills.
And there's already evidence that data centers in other places, like Northern Virginia, kind of the hot core of the data center boom, in those places, the development is already pushing utility bills up. So 2 universities published an analysis last year. They found that without policy changes, these data centers could increase wholesale electricity costs by about 8% nationwide by 2030. And like you said, Taylor, that comes at a time where we're already seeing bills rise in Colorado and across the country.
Okay, so power is something we could essentially all be affected by if more data centers come to Colorado. Another big concern I've heard about is how much water they use.
Right, because they use evaporative cooling, essentially the same technology that you'll find in like a swamp cooler. They use that to cool off these giant servers, and they can use up to 5 million gallons a day, which is as much as a small city. Obviously, water is a scarce resource in the Mountain West, especially this year. We're seeing this huge snow droughts, entire mountain landscapes absent of snow, and that means that we could have less water in the spring and the summer.
So from everything we've been talking about, you can imagine states might be wanting to ban data centers entirely. But of course, there's a flip side. Big developments come with big investments.
Right, and there are states that have been cashing in on them. We mentioned that Colorado has nearly 60 data centers already. Well, for comparison, the data center map shows that Virginia has hundreds, more than 560 actually, thanks to generous tax incentives for building there.
Data center proponents will point to their massive investments in the communities where they've built. These giant data centers can bring in thousands of jobs, although most of them temporary. And the real benefit, the proponents say, is in property taxes. In some areas in Virginia, data centers make up as much as a third of the local tax base. Data center companies also say they're evolving to be able to use closed-loop water cooling systems, where they're not having to pull in new water every day and therefore can use less water.
Okay, so that's a bit of the data center landscape. You can see why these things are tempting for governments and potentially troublesome for neighbors. So now it's time to talk about how Colorado is considering handling them. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
You love podcasts to keep up with the news. Now there's an easy way to find out what's happening in Colorado every day. The Colorado Today podcast is new from the same trusted source that brings you Purplish. You'll get the top stories, on-the-ground reporting, and moments of curiosity. Follow Colorado Today for the statewide news you need each weekday on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
There are 2 data center bills this session, with very different visions for the industry. Basically, you have one set of lawmakers wanting to roll out the welcome mat with some environmental requirements.
And on the other side, you've got other lawmakers saying, not only are we not going to incentivize you to build your data centers here, but if you do choose to build in Colorado, then you need to follow strict environmental rules and try to be a good neighbor.
Let's start with Bill number 1, House Bill 1030. That's the one that has the industry's backing.
So pro-business Democrats are sponsoring this bill, and here's what it does. So essentially, it's a 20-year tax break for these data center developers on paying state sales and use tax. That applies to stuff like computer equipment, software, energy storage systems, AC, but most importantly, these AI computer chips, these NVIDIA computer chips that are the biggest expense often for these data center developers who are building new infrastructure. Colorado is also among a minority of states that don't have some sort of tax incentive for data centers at this point. They're looking at roughly 36 other states that have offered some sort of incentive, and they're saying, look, we might want in on all this development too.
We have to be creative in how we think about this and say, we're not getting the revenue currently because the companies are going elsewhere.
That's Democratic Representative Alex Valdez of Denver, a main sponsor of this bill.
If we want to compete, we have to, see this for what it is, and that is a massive addition of local tax, a massive addition to pay bill tax, and all of the other accompanying taxes that go with buying concrete and everything else that you need to build with.
To get the tax incentives in the bill, data center companies would have to meet certain benchmarks. That includes things like having to invest $250 million in infrastructure in the first 5 years. They'd also have to deliver on the promise of bringing jobs to the state, although the bill doesn't specify how many jobs. And they'd have to start building these things pretty quickly. They have to break ground within 2 years of being certified to build.
The state won't just take developers' word for it as far as these requirements go. Lawmakers want to create a new oversight board specifically to oversee data centers and make sure companies meet the criteria that you just listed. The board would have 9 members that are appointed by legislative leaders and the governor, and they would include people with experience in things like water resource management, renewable energy, plus representatives for the construction industry.
And this is not a new effort. A bill very similar to this failed last year with Valdez also as a sponsor. And like Taylor said, there are lots of states with data center incentives. And Taylor, do you know how similar Colorado's proposed approach is to what states have already done?
Valdez told us he's really looking at what other states have done as examples of what not to do, mostly. He's hoping that his bill offers these tax incentives but with much more of an environmental requirement than other states.
And I've taken a pretty careful look at this bill, and it does have some real environmental protections. So data center operators have to have a strategy for water conservation. They also have to work with utilities to make sure bills don't surge as a result of all this development. And they also have to use backup generators that are a little better in terms of air pollution than standard systems available right now.
Okay, so a lot of things in this bill. And as far as the legislative process goes, sponsors actually delayed a hearing on the proposal earlier this month. What's happening there?
Backers of the bill say they needed more time to consider amendments. Valdez said they're looking at further tightening the water conservation rules and maybe adding some more transparency measures.
One thing that's been on my mind with all of this is that there seems to be a real tension around the money. Because I look at the fiscal note in the industry-backed bill, and oh boy.
So the state is already $850 million short for the next fiscal year and having to make painful cuts to Medicaid. And according to nonpartisan legislative staff, this bill could trigger higher taxes on poor people to pay for the data center company tax breaks. That's going to be a really tough sell. Let's switch gears now to Bill number 2, Senate Bill 102. This is the environmentalist-backed bill.
Okay, some Democrats are way less worried about making Colorado desirable to data center companies, and they are way more concerned with what may happen if more do come here.
So this isn't really about incentives. It's all about regulations.
These are big companies, Meta and Amazon and everybody else. They can afford to frickin' pay their own way. So we're going to make sure that they do that.
That's Democratic State Senator Kathy Kipp. She thinks data center companies will build here even without tax incentives, and she wants to make sure that when they do, they aren't burdening the power grid or the environment.
Data center companies will have to report every year the amount of water and electricity their data centers use and pay for enough renewable energy development to offset their electricity. And if utilities have to build anything new to power these data centers, companies have to cover that cost.
The main idea here is that these lawmakers don't want data center developers to result in a massive increase of fossil fuels burned in Colorado. Deborah Kapeloff is the Clean Energy Policy Advisor at Western Resource Advocates, one of the leading environmental groups at the Capitol. And she worries that data centers coming to Colorado could really just destroy any hope of Colorado achieving its goals around climate change.
We'd see a lot of backsliding on that because when you need to just have massive amounts of energy come online and you do kind of an all-source requests for proposals for these resources, what might end up being selected is a lot of new fossil resources that are then going to be online for decades to come.
But critics of the bill say this approach is just way too heavy-handed.
Yeah, like a lobbyist for the data center industry that we spoke with. He said the bill's requirements are too, quote, punitive. Unsurprisingly, he thinks Colorado should be focusing on tax breaks to be competitive in winning development, not regulations to discourage it.
And then you have Representative Valdez, who argues there's not even enough available renewable energy in the state to actually meet data center needs.
So we got these two really different visions of data center development in Colorado. Lucas, you're actually in the Capitol day in and day out. Do you have a sense of which one of these bills is more likely to pass?
So I think it's safe to say that neither of these bills will pass in their current form. This is not an issue that splits along traditional party lines, and one of the biggest divisions here is between factions of Democrats. The politics are going to really come into play here, so let's take a look at that next.
So Governor Jared Polis has this reputation for being pretty pro-tech, pro-business. Do we know where he is and his thoughts on these two bills? I think, in his last State of the State speech that he told lawmakers that this is the final year to send him bills, and he might be more friendly to businesses than whoever follows him. So would that include this tax incentive bill?
First of all, Polis has not taken a position on this year's bills, on either of them. But a spokesperson for his office shared a statement and said that Polis's, quote, North Star is making sure that data center companies don't increase energy costs on everyday Coloradans and that they support any grid upgrades and innovation that are required. But Polis has also said that the bill that failed last year that offered tax breaks didn't go far enough to empower state regulators to protect the state's resources, the environment, and its residents and utility consumers. So it sounds like in this case, his support for the tech industry maybe isn't as strong as his concerns about the potential environmental and energy downsides.
Okay, so it sounds like he is actually pretty sympathetic to some of the environmental concerns here. Sponsors of both bills have told me that they are open to compromise because they really want to get something through this year. Here's Senator Kipp.
We are considering our bill to be a living document. We want to continue to take people's feedback and work to make it better.
We talked to Kipp and her co-sponsor, Representative Kyle Brown, and they said whatever changes they make, they will not be adding tax incentives. And for Representative Valdez, without the incentives and if the environmental regulations are too strict, he says data center developers will just go elsewhere.
Let's say their bill doesn't pass and our bill doesn't pass. This stuff is all going to end up in Wyoming, and it's going to be burning fossil fuel, and it's going to be polluting, and it's not good for any of us. And that is an outcome that, as a true environmentalist, I'm not okay with.
It's important to note that some states that have offered really generous incentives are now revisiting those, and some places are even considering moratoriums on data center development. Valdez insists that his approach is finding a balance between tax incentives that will bring development here and some environmental protections to guard against the downsides.
Let's try to wrap this up a little bit. Colorado's in this really unique place when it comes to data centers. We're this state with all kinds of tech. They're some of the biggest companies we have, but we don't have a ton of data centers compared to other places. And so we have this opportunity to learn and try to get the benefits without the downsides. Lucas, do you think that there's like a real chance of that happening, considering we're seeing fights playing out over this at the local level as well as the state level?
I mean, I think it's inevitable because this is not going to go away. These data centers are only going to become more and more common, and the demands on them are going to only increase. So Colorado's going to have to contend with this both on the state level and the local level, one way or another.
And Taylor, you were at this most recent event for GES at the Globeville, Elyria, Swansea fight over the CoreSite data center. I've covered it too. And I know those activists are asking specifically for the company to invest in their neighborhood. Like, what sort of things do they want? How do they think this project could be somewhat beneficial for their community?
They want an agreement or some kind of guarantee that they won't be on the hook for the data center's power use. They also have some sort of like moral guidelines they want CoreSite to agree to. They want them to not host any servers for surveillance companies.
Wow.
They want them to agree to not sign any non-disclosure agreements with Denver Water, for example. They really want transparency. They want to know what's going on in their neighborhood.
We want the regulatory agencies, whether that's the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, to not grant any more permits because this is the first of 3 buildings. And so even if they get to finish this first building, we want them to be monitored. We want stronger enforcement. We want stronger rules so that they can't build the second and third building at the same design level that doesn't take into accountability any sort of protections for our communities.
I think that gets back to what you were saying, Lucas, that like there's this whole question of inevitability. We're all using AI, we all use the internet, so these facilities are going to happen one way or another. Make your peace with it, try to find the benefits where you can. But do you think that's right? Is there real inevitability here? Or if Colorado makes it too difficult, will these facilities just be elsewhere and that's fine?
I mean, I think that's part of the fundamental divide between the 2 bills and the supporters of either one, right? There is a lot of talk that these are inevitable, and in some ways they're inevitable, but whether they come to Colorado or not, I think that's where people differ.
Environmentalists will point to Globeville, Elyria, Swansea as an example of data centers are already here. They're already coming here without these tax incentives. But when you talk to the data center industry lobbyist, or I spoke to a CEO, they say they're not going to build any more without these kinds of incentives in place, like 37 states already have. So that's also a divide. What's true? Will they come anyways, or will they really hit the road?
Yeah, and I think this also really reminds me of something I covered when I was the Capitol way back in 2019 when the state debated new rules for oil and gas development. And in that case, there was an acknowledgement that oil and gas development would continue happening in Colorado. But the question is, like, where should it be happening? And what role communities have in saying it should be here or it should be there or it should have these walls protecting it or these environmental protections in place. It seems like that's also what's going on here. We have local communities that are saying this should just not be a free-for-all. We deserve a say here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important to remember this is the first year we've seen an environmental regulation bill for this industry. It's always only been the tax incentive bill, and environmentalists have been really focused on fighting against that. But now they have an actual proposal for a roadmap of how to do this the way they would want to do it here.
Right. And I think that talking to these environmentalists, some of them see a potential upside. If you could get these tech companies to agree to invest in renewable energy development, well, that's kind of a good thing. That could maybe, drive the market for wind and solar. And I think that's a really good point, and maybe a good place to wrap this up, is that we see that there's a willingness this time around to maybe arrive at some sort of Colorado approach to this whole huge national story.
And whether there can be common ground on this approach remains to be seen.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Lucas Brady Woods.
I'm Taylor Dalvin.
And I'm Sam Brash. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf, sound design and engineering by Shane Rumsey. Our theme music is by Brad Turner. Megan Verlee is our executive producer, and Tegan Wendland provided extra editorial support for this episode.
Purplish will be back in your feeds in 2 weeks. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.